Israel taken into captivity. This is one of the major events of the Old Testament. Just to review, the kingdom that David and Solomon built divided into two. You had the southern 2 tribes and the northern 10 tribes. The southern tribes were called Judah. The northern 10 tribes were called Israel. Israel was a godless nation. It never had a king that truly followed the Lord. And yet, as the story says, some of the greatest prophets ever known went to the northern tribes called Israel. Well, in this story right here, we see how they are taken off into captivity and became known as the 10 lost tribes. Actuality, they weren't totally lost. There's still people today that can trace back their ancestry to those tribes. And actually, today with DNA testing, there's a lot of interesting things coming out that they may more and more be able to be identified. But that's not my area. The main study here is about Assyria, Nineveh, and their empire, and the Samaritans. Those are two interesting things. First of all, the Assyrian. Assyria was the first major world empire that swept across and took over Israel. They were slow. This took many generations, one king after the other, that all had the same goal of taking over that part of the world. Their main goal was to take over Egypt, and they slowly moved. They did it because they were the masters of the siege. They would go into a nation and they would take years conquering that nation, mainly by putting the capital under siege. And once they captured that nation, then their main thing was to take the people off of the nation and put them someplace else. They tried, first of all, to just allow the people to stay there. If they remained loyal, that was fine. But if they rebelled, which they almost always did, then they would go back and take the people off the land, put them someplace else, and put someone else there. They were the first ones really to realize that if you move people around, if you take the people off the land so that they're not still living in the same place where they were born and raised and where their parents died, people were not as loyal to someone else's land as they were to their own. So that was what they did. They were also a very cruel army, probably one of the worst in history. Things that they would do to a city that they conquered, we can't talk about. It was just absolutely cruel. They put out the lesson: do not rebel against us. If you do, we will come back. We will take you off the land. But before we do, you will suffer. You will suffer extreme agony and pain. Well, that's what happened here. It's interesting that it took them 3 tries. They went in there 3 times. I find that interesting because Judah was the same way. When Babylon took over Judah, it was 3 times before the third one where they took them all off the land. Both the north and the south kept rebelling and eventually were taken off the land. The way that the Assyrians did it, they would take away the leaders and the skilled workers. They would take these people back to Nineveh, and they would either train their workers, or else they would just put them to work there. But then they also, every able-bodied man especially that they could take, they would put him into their army. Not necessarily as a soldier, but as a way to conquer other cities. They would put these people out in front, and they were often killed. But that was okay with them because at least it wasn't their people. They would put these captured people, the ones that would go out and build the ramp that would go up the wall. And of course, people building that ramp going up the wall were often killed. They just keep putting people there until the ramp was done. They used conquered nations to build those ramps and to get more nations. It was a sad time in Israel's history. Amos, the prophet Amos, predicted this time, and his predictions were fulfilled when the Syrians took him away. The way they would do it, the captured people would have to walk hundreds of miles naked. And they were attached together with a system of strings and fish hooks that pierced their lower lip. Amos talked about this. Amos said that this is how the people would be taken away. And truly that is what happened. This king that took him over, Sennacherib, is the same one that in a future story, when we talk about how he attacks Judah, this is the same one. He's not the one that started the siege, but he's the one that finished it, and he's the one that treated the people. And so it's interesting that during this siege and during this time of taking over Israel, a lot of the Israelites were able to escape and go south. And they went down to Judah, and they actually went to Jerusalem, and they weren't necessarily invited into the city, but they were able to build their houses outside the city walls. Now, if you picture that the city of David kind of droops down, well, they went to the west of the city, and they built outside the city walls. Later, Hezekiah, in preparation for Sennacherib coming to his nation, he built a wall to the west to include these refugees that came down from Israel. So in that sense, he finally included them in to his people. So these were actually some of the Israelites that had gone down to Judah. Well, this story gives you the beginning of the Samaritans. We hear about the Samaritans throughout the New Testament. You have the Good Samaritan. You have the woman at the well, which was a Samaritan. You have Jesus going to Judah, Samaria, and the othermost parts of the world. You have Philip going to Samaria. It all starts right here. When Nineveh took the people off of the land, they brought in a people group over in the Babylon area and brought them in and placed them there. They then intermarried with some of the Israelites that were still there. Assyria would just leave the very low class. Well, these people mixed together, and they formed a new nation called Samaria. These are the ones that the priests came back and taught. They basically were taught that the 5 books of Moses were the only scripture, because they didn't hold to all the stuff that Judah did. And so and to this day, the Samaritans are still there. They're still a group of people who can trace their ancestry back to these very same people. And they still hold to the first 5 books of Moses as being their scripture. It all starts right here. These were 5 eastern tribes that came to live in this area. Well, as I say, this is one of the great historical events of the Bible. trust you find all this history interesting and as you understand the Scripture. Come back next week when we continue on with story insights on the story of the week. We'll see you next week.